What if I told you that your family didn't vanish? They were just deleted. What if the gold sitting in the vaults of North Carolina was pulled from the soil of your grandfathers while the state was busy changing your surname from Indian to mulatto on the tax list? Well, today we stop the paper genocide.
Welcome to my podcast. It's a window to the past of history, ancestry, and genealogy, not a story. No, no, no. We're 80% African and 20% other. Is another lie. If you
Welcome back. I am your host, Lenore with My History Verified, and we aren't talking about the $5 tribe story you heard in school. We're going deep into the 1831 Bertie County deed books and the 1850 slave schedules. We are uncovering how the Williamses and Little families used the doctrine of discovery to turn the original dark-skinned Tuscarora into free Negro laborers on their own stolen gold mines. When the land was taken, an Indian chief went back and tried to get his land, and the colonizers and settlers looked him in the eye and told him his appearance mattered more than his blood. We're cross-referencing the boys held as mulatto property in 1850 with the old men who stood up in 1900 to say, I am Tuscarora. This isn't just genealogy. It's a forensic investigation of a crime scene that spans 300 years. All right, so let's get into the meat of this. The Tuscarora tribe provides a powerful case study for paper genocide, the perfect case, particularly in how historical documents were used to reclassify and erase their original identity. The Tuscarora and paper genocide. First, it is the forced reclassification. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the paper genocide process involved systematically reclassifying Tuscarora individuals in official records. People who were originally documented as Indian were often retroactively labeled as colored, mulatto, or free person of color on birth, marriage, and death certificates. Then we have the binary system. This reclassification was a calculated effort to force diverse populations into a strict black-white binary. By removing the Indian category, the state effectively erased their legal and tribal existence on paper, making it nearly impossible for future generations to prove continuous tribal lineage for federal recognition. Then we have the impact of the Racial Integrity Act, in which the policies like the Virginia 1924 Racial Integrity Act, led by Walter Plecker, targeted any individuals with mixed heritage, declaring they were merely mixed-blooded Negroes, just to strip them of native status. Now, this legacy persists today as the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina continues to fight for official recognition by correcting these historical misrepresentations. Then there are distinct physical characteristics that one cannot deny. But as the general or the paper genocide took hold, these descriptions were replaced with generic racial terms designated to disenfranchise the Indian. Some of the patrilineal clans and bands are and I'll spell it Kautanoah, Katanoa. The next one is Akawenteka, translated as the people of the water. Then we have the Skaruren, Skaruren, translated as hemp gatherers or people of the shirt. This group gave the larger nation its name. Then we have the matrilineal clans. As part of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois tradition, identity is passed down through the mother. The Tuscarora traditionally has 7 clans. They are Bear Clan, often called the Medicine Clan, Turtle Clan, sometimes divided into Big Turtle and Sand Turtle Eel, Wolf Clan, Beaver Clan, Deer Clan, Snipe Clan, and Eel Sand Turtle Clan. There's also associated absorbed tribes into the Tuscarora, often absorbed smaller neighboring tribes, especially during the colonial era of displacement. And that would be the Chawanok and the Wapamock, which is a smaller Algonquin tribes that joined the Tuscarora to escape white settlement. Then there is the Rokon, which is historically linked to the Tuscarora. Some modern descendants identify as the Cape Fear Band of Skakora Rokon. There's also the Tuscarora Nation east of the mountain. Included in my research on paper genocide, there are specific surnames central to tracking how the Tuscarora people in North Carolina were reclassified in original records from Indian to colored, mulatto, or black, beginning with Combo and Chavez, Hammond or Hammonds and Revels, Brooks, Jacobs, and Maynor, Blount, Jones, Kearsay, and Smith, Parks, Lowry, and Jones. Then we have surnames linked to early reclassification. Now, as these families migrated or remained in areas like Robeson County, they were often swept into like broad racial categories to strip them of their tribal status. Now, there are some records from the Native Heritage Project and community histories which identify additional names frequently appearing in free color or free people of color registers or transitional documents. Those surnames are Allen, Miller, and Smith. These surnames are found in both North Carolina and actually New York Tuscarora populations, showing a clear ancestral link despite reclassification. Then we have the Locust and Lynch. These families in Wilson County transited or descended from Tuscarora, African, and European ancestors who were often labeled free families of color. And just because they say that they are African, don't have to be. So you have to check into all of the documents. Then we have Kane and Gibson. Those surnames are specific individuals recorded as remaining in North Carolina after the final 1802 removal. Then we have Patterson, Thompson, and Williams. These surnames currently recognized in enrolled tribal communities that have historically faced documentation challenges. Let's get into some of the historical chiefs' surnames. Now, many modern families trace their lineage back to the signers of the 18th and 19th century land deeds and treaties such as surnames of Chiefs Chew, Cassie or Keziah, Jack, Johnson, Printup, and War Chief, just to name a few. Now, just because some of these indoctrination books list the same old tribes or names or surnames, trying to confuse you and make you believe that these are the only surnames or families that were American Indians that they documented. So you have to think outside the box when you're doing your genealogy research and research your name or your ancestor's surname regardless of what the indoctrination is showing. Now, research into Bertie County, Indian Woods, and Robeson County land deeds and Free People of Color registers reveals several surnames linked to the Tuscarora. These surnames are often not as widely known as those like Locklear or Chavez, but they appear in historical records connected to the tribe during periods when classification were shifting. Some surnames that appear in 18th century records, particularly related to the Indian Woods area, include Boone, with or without an E, Basket, Barfield, Taylor, Rogers, and Mitchell. These families often intermarried with different documented as Tuscarora, but their descendants were sometimes later classified differently in official records. You have to keep that in mind. Then we have historians also identifying transitional names from families who lived in Tuscarora territory during the late 1600s to early 1800s. And these names include like Flowers, Parks, and others. Now, here's another reason why some of the Tuscarora were not listed. And it is because they fought the invaders for the land and the resources. They were resistant to invasion, settlers, and colonizers. Okay? Now, while the history books often focus on bureaucratic eras, the deeper research suggests that the reclassification of the Tuscarora was, in fact, a deliberate retaliatory tool used by the state to punish a people who refused to stop fighting. Okay? That means that the Tuscarora they didn't bend, they didn't break, they were not compromising or trying to negotiate or sell out or help other tribes or help the British or the Spanish fight other tribes. Right? Now, then we have paper genocide as a weapon. Now, as the main conflict ended, the war continued on paper. So the state used documentation to ensure the Tuscarora could never rise as a political power again. That's deep. Now, we have the administrative erasure. Historian David Laver argues that the colonial government used a deceptive sleight of hand to strip the Indian designation from groups that remained in their homelands, effectively erasing their legal existence to prevent them from claiming treaty rights. The color trap, by reclassifying warriors and their families as mulatto or colored, the state stripped them of their sovereign status. This moves them from being a nation with land rights to being subjects under Jim Crow laws. Then we have evading removal and the swamps. For many Tuscarora families, survival meant refusing to leave for New York or Oklahoma. These dark-skinned, resistant families retreated into the swamps of Robeson County to evade the clutches of forced removal. Because they stayed and continued to live as a distinct community, officials like Walter Plecker later targeted them with extreme intensity, claiming there were, quote, no real Indians, unquote, left in order to justify the theft of their remaining land and identity. Then we have the legacy of the fight. Now, this history of fighting back is exactly why the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina has faced such a steep battle for recognition today. The state has historically ignored treaty evidence and ancestral land claims as a continuation of the punishment for their 18th century resistance. Now remember, the reclassification wasn't a mistake. It was a strategic continuation of the Tuscarora War, intended to finish on paper what could not be fully accomplished on the battlefield. Now, there are some examples of state-sponsored fights. There's violence against the indigenous people during colonial wars. And they were state sponsored, meaning the government was involved. The newly appointed mayors or administrators of the land, which was granted by the Queen or King of England or Britain at the time, or the government of the 13 colonies. Now let's get into how much land was confiscated by the invaders. The confiscation of Tuscarora land was massive. It was multi-stage, processed, systematically reducing the territory from millions of acres to virtually nothing. Now, the first major confiscation was the 1717 Treaty. Following the defeat of the Southern faction in the Tuscarora War, the invaders confiscated the vast majority of traditional lands. As a reward for neutrality, the northern faction under King Tom Blount was restricted to a single reservation called Indian Woods in Bertie County. The acreage was that this reservation was initially approximately 53,000 to 56,000 acres. The result of this treaty presented a loss of over 95% of their original ancestral territory in a single decade. Then we have the lease era and encroachment, which took place between 1760s and 1803. Now, even the 56,000 acres promised in perpetuity were not safe. Settlers and state officials used exploitative long-term leases to move onto the land. Encroachment was by the late 1700s. State-appointed commissioners were consistently carving away parcels for right settlement, often paying the tribe mere pennies or nothing at all. Shrinking borders. Now, by the early 1800s, the once massive reservation had been illegally whittled down to a remnant. Then we have the final dispossession of 1803 and between 1831. Now, the final stage of paper genocide involved the legal erasure of their remaining land rights. In 1803, removal under a treaty directed by Thomas Jefferson, a large contingent was pressured to move to New York, and much of the remaining land was leased out by the state for 99 years. Now, when you get a chance, take the time to examine specific maps or boundary descriptions used in the 1748 land plat to see exactly which modern-day towns sit on that stolen land. Now, let's see if we can generate a list of Tuscarora tribal chiefs and their descendants today. I'm going to also examine some of the specific maps as much as I can and call the maps out. Now, remember, tracing the lineage of a nation through centuries of reclassification and land theft requires looking at both the official treaty signers and the families who maintain them. First, King Tom Blount, Upper Tuscarora, signed the 1780 treaty that established the Indian Woods Reservation. He adopted the surname of his colonial friend, Thomas Blount. Then there's Chief James Blount, who succeeded King Tom Blount and petitioned for land protection in 1757. Then there is Chief William Pugh, Pug, a prominent leader who secured land for Tuscarora families in Bladen County, now called Robinson County. This was in 1753, and this was done to escape settler harassment. Then there's Chief William Saccharissa Chew, who is a major 19th century leader whose name remains central to Tuscarora lineage today. Then we have other treaty signers and council chiefs. Other documented chiefs include Thomas Basket, Harry Patterson, William Anderson, John Rogers, Samuel Jacobs, Daniel Printrup, Garlow. Then there's Johnson, John Smith, Isaac Miller, Jefferson Chew, and Hibbert Chew. It's very important to know some of the surnames, the land masses, the maps, and the descendants of these chiefs or tribes that carried on these names to modern surnames today. Now, modern descendants are primarily enrolled in the Tuscarora Nation of New York, the Six Nations of the Grand River in Ontario, and various bands in North Carolina. Doesn't mean everybody went to New York, the reservations on North Carolina, or to Oklahoma. Okay? Doesn't mean that who they say are the Native Americans of Tuscarora now are the only ones, and that they are light-skinned or bright-skinned with straight hair. You have to step outside that box. You can't let anybody push you in that box and try to contain you there. And so that you don't want to be pigeonholed into phenotypes of what indoctrination says the Tuscarora Amerindian looks like. All right? So we're going to go and identify ancestral lines, which is families with the following surnames who are recognized as direct descendants of the Indian Woods chiefs and treaty. The signers' descendants are Locklear, Brayboy, Lowry, McDowell, Deese, Brayboy, Bridgers, Roberts, Blunt, Pug, and Smith. Enrolled surnames. That means that they went and got on some type of Indian role. Now, there are Indian roles prior to the Dawes rolls. The Dawes rolls is just the final enrollment system before the finally closing any systems after that date, after that time frame for the Dawes rolls. All right, so those surnames officially documented in tribal enrollment include Anderson, Bazell, Chu, Claus, Cusick, Doctor, Dubuque, Fish, Henry, Hill, Hewitt, Garlow, Green, Jack, Jacobs, Longboat, Miracle, Martin, Mackay, Miller, Moses, Patterson, Stats, Johnson, and Pemberton. Now there is currently a search to find the descendants of the Cactotan iron furnace. And many of these same names that I just mentioned are some of the names of the remains found for the remains that were found on or buried on the Cactotan landmass. All right. That archaeology research for the Cactotan iron furnace is stating that they are African. And because I personally spoke with an archaeologist for it, and I was asked to join the research team for helping to find the descendants of those buried there, which were the workers of the Cactotan iron furnace of various ages and genders. They're being referred to as African. I beg to differ and state that they are not African, and not everyone is an African. So look into all of that for the whatever it would be, the Maryland, I believe the Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina landmass, because the governors between those three and the invaders and settlers between those three states communicated together, and they intertwined and sold prisoners of wars, indentured servitude, and slaves between those three states.
We're 80% African and 20% other. Is another lie. If you know, then you know. Welcome to my ancestors' voices, such an alignment. Welcome to my podcast with your host Lenora, better known as my history verified.